Dennis Hodgson. There we go. Okay. And Karen Hardy. All right. Emily Merchant. And Wynn Brown. And just so everybody knows, as you put your questions into the Q&A, then Emily and Wynn will be organizing them. And at the end of the presentations and Q&A sessions that we have with our PhD students and each panelist, then that will be the question time from all the participants. So I'd like to start right now. Let's get right to it. Our first panelist is Dr. Samuel Preston, who is professor of sociology at the University of Pennsylvania, where he has been since 1979 in a variety of capacities, including director of the Population Studies Center, the Frederick J. Warren Professor of Demography, chair of the Sociology Department, and dean of the School of Arts and Sciences. He was president of the PAA in 1984 when he was only 41, making him the youngest ever PAA president. So now Dr. Preston will have about 15 minutes to present, and then we'll have a PhD student who will be leading a Q&A with him afterwards. All right, Sam, take it away.
Well, thank you, John, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks again to the committee, the History Committee, for arranging this session, and to Sarah and Eileen in particular. I'm going to try to get the slides up now. Wish me luck. How's it look?
Very good. Just
I see slides. Does anybody else see slides?
yes, but
Yeah, click on slideshow from beginning. There we go. Click.
Yeah, I did.
yeah, press the enable editing too.
Yeah, click enable editing. Maybe that'll do it.
Where it says resume slideshow, there's a little drop down that says resume slideshow.
I think it'll go.
Perfect.
Great, Sam.
That looks okay?
Mm-hmm.
Delighted to hear that. Okay. So I'm going to look back briefly on the main theme of the paper, then talk about some reactions to it, and then try to update the analysis to see whether it still seems valid or has been overturned by more recent data and research. The focus of the paper was a contrast between trends in measures of well-being among the elderly and among children. It's an unusual pairing. I think what unites the two groups is that they are both, for the most part, out of the labor force. They require some set of public and private transfers for their sustenance. And there were several indications that these transfers were working better for older people than for children. This slide from the paper shows official poverty levels in 1970 and 1982. During that period, there had been a major shift in the profile. The dark area on the right shows the reduction in elderly poverty over the period, while the shaded area on the left shows the rise in child poverty over the period. In 1970, older people had the highest poverty levels. By 1982, it was children, with a poverty level of 22% versus 14% for the elderly. I described some other indicators, including suicide, mental health, all-cause mortality, school achievement, and several others. This slide lists some of the major factors that I argued were at work. Close to half of the rise in child poverty during the period was associated with changes in family structure, what I called a disappearing act by fathers from households with children. It was also a product of large declines under President Reagan in funding for the program called Aid to Families with Dependent Children. I argued here that there were three self-interested sources of political support for programs for the elderly. Only the third type is available to children. Children themselves obviously don't vote, and adults don't vote on behalf of programs that would enhance their own childhood, which of course is behind them. We pass through life in only one direction, and that creates, I think, a large age bias in our interests and attentions. Parents are a relatively weak voting bloc. We estimated that they represented only 38% of the voters in the election of 1982. In short, political support for children requires a sense of collective responsibility. It takes a village, in the phrase later popularized by Hillary Clinton. So that was the basic story. It was published in Demography, and a shorter version was published in Scientific American. Reactions were split along predictable lines. Advocates for older people were not happy. They benefited from a sense that the elderly were in poor shape, a perception that I was undercutting. AARP, in its monthly magazine, Modern Maturity, called me in an editorial, quote, "America's leading crusader against the elderly." Richard Sussman summoned me to defend myself before the high councils of NIA in Bethesda. But advocates for children, of course, on the other hand, were happy to spread the message. Albert Shanker, president of the American Federation of Teachers, wrote an editorial in the New York Times endorsing the arguments. The biggest supporter was Senator and sociologist Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who frequently cited the paper and including in a letter recently released to incoming First Lady Hillary Clinton. The most direct research outcome was a result of a meeting of the Committee on Population of the National Academy of Sciences that was held the morning after the presidential address. The committee was attracted to the general theme and decided to pursue a project on it more or less immediately. The result was an excellent volume called The Vulnerable. This took an international perspective, relying heavily on the Luxembourg Income Dynamics database. A major finding was that children in the United States started out in a worse economic shape than children in other advanced countries, and that government policies in the United States did less to alleviate their disadvantage than elsewhere. Tim Smeating and Janet Gornick showed much the same thing in a recent 2018 paper in the Annual Review of Sociology. Senator Moynihan, Tim Smeating, and Lee Rainwater organized an excellent conference on family change with a focus on children's well-being. An important paper on the broad theme was published 2 years ago in Demography by Christina Gibson Davis and Christine Percheski. I'll say more about that in a moment. So now I'm going to try to update the analysis a little bit by citing some more recent data and research on the relative conditions of children and the elderly. This graph from the Peterson Foundation shows the long-term trends in the official poverty series. I put a red vertical line in 1984. You can see to the left of that line the crossover between child poverty and elderly poverty that I had described. Since then, the difference has been relatively stable, with both series showing a slight downward trend. Children were more affected by the Great Recession, then they recovered a bit faster. This graph uses the official poverty criteria, which don't take account of taxes and in-kind transfers. Here in red is an alternative historical series for child poverty produced by a group at Columbia. This series does take account of taxes and in-kind transfers, including such things as school lunch programs and housing assistance. It also differs in other features, including being anchored to a contemporary consumption threshold. You can see in red that there's some improvement in child poverty in contrast to the official series in blue dots. The authors show that most of the improvement is indeed a result of taxes and government transfers. They want us to recognize that child poverty levels have improved and that anti-poverty measures are a major reason. Here's the same figure for the elderly. You can see steady improvements for the elderly using either poverty series. Using the red series for both children and the elderly, the differences between them have narrowed And by 2018, which is not shown here, they have basically disappeared. If I had an hour, I could discuss the pros and cons of the two poverty measures, but I obviously don't. So let me just point out that the medical expenses, including medical insurance premiums, are subtracted from income in the supplementary poverty series, but not in the official series. This subtraction raises elderly poverty by 46%, while it raises child poverty by 18%. So it makes a very big difference whether you include medical expenses or not. I note that it's the only type of expenses that are included in these poverty measures. One indicator I did not examine was wealth. Christina Gibson Davis and Christine Percheski have made up for this omission in their excellent 2018 demography article. Here's a figure from their paper, which is, I think, pretty dramatic. Using the survey of consumer finance, it shows a rise over the period of 45% in the median wealth for elderly households. For households with a child under 18, there is a reduction in median wealth of 55% over the 24-year period. Median wealth for elderly households was 4 times that of households with children in 1989. By 2013, it was 13 times higher. And the contrast they show was even more dramatic among households in the bottom half of the distribution. Median wealth was negative for the bottom half of households with children in 2013. So the rise in wealth inequality in the United States generally has hit families with children with special force. My address included some data showing that per capita government transfers to the elderly were much larger than transfers to children. The Urban Institute provides information on these transfers annually in its publication Kids Count. It examines scores of federal programs and estimates the share of each program that is received by different groups. This slide is drawn from the 2020 report. The federal government is now spending about $30,000 per year per person above age 65, compared to $5,000 per child. The absolute gap has grown over time while the relative gap has declined a little bit. There's a slight decline for both groups since 2010, which was the peak of the Great Recession, a year that produced very large transfers. The leading expenditure on children, incidentally, takes the form of tax provisions, while income security in the household accounts for only 11% of the total. The Urban Institute also projects federal expenditures from 2019 to 2030. The projections are based upon existing law and Congressional Budget Office projections. This table shows the results. Only 2% of the budget growth anticipated by 2030 will go to programs for children. Let me turn to mortality, which I often do. Older adults die at a faster rate than children in all populations. To see how the different ages are doing, it helps to compare US data to data from other countries. This figure from a paper by Jana Veerboom and me shows the ratio of age-specific death rates in the United States to the mean of the 5 largest European countries. The dark line at the top refers to 2017. You can see that the ratio of US mortality to European mortality has gotten worse over the 21st century at all ages except above age 85, where we actually have lower death rates than Europe. Infants and children in the US are disadvantaged, but they are not exceptionally disadvantaged. The worst performance of all occurs among young adults in their 20s and 30s, where US death rates are now 3 times higher than European rates. The very high US mortality in these ages is clearly related to drug poisoning. Ann Case and Angus Deaton have drawn special attention to ages 45 to 54, where they document rising mortality from what they term deaths of despair, which includes drugs, alcohol-related deaths, and suicide. Childhood doesn't look too bad in this graph, but what if the high adult mortality were at least partially traceable to what Mark Hayward has called the long arm of childhood? One useful linkage between childhood and adulthood is provided by a recently developed scale called Adverse Childhood Experiences. It's based on retrospective questions to adults on childhood physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, parents' mental illness, substance abuse, and family dysfunction and breakup. The scale is highly predictive of poor health in adulthood, not surprisingly. This slide shows the mean number of adverse childhood experiences by birth cohort. It's based on BRFSS surveys in 23 states. The number of adverse childhood experiences per adult has doubled across these birth cohorts. I put little stars by the deaths of despair cohort and the children that I focused on in children and the elderly. I'm not drawing any conclusions here. I'm speculating really that the long arm of childhood may be reflected in the terrible recent deterioration in US mortality rates at ages beyond childhood. That's of course in addition to the labor force problems described by Case and Deaton for poorly educated workers in particular. This seems to me to be an issue worth investigating. Because of time constraints, I've said nothing about family changes since 1984. So let me point out that the single largest contributor to the increase in adverse childhood circumstances was a rise in parental divorce or separation. The prevalence rose from 14% to 39% across these cohorts. That's consistent with census data that shows a continued decline in the proportion of children living with a married couple.
Sam, this is the 2-minute warning. Sorry.
Pardon?
I said this is the 2-minute warning. Sorry.
Okay, good. I'm on time. So that really is the main course. My final slide is sort of for dessert. It shows annual appropriations for two agencies that are dear to our hearts, our principal funders. One is the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development. The other is the National Institute of Aging. Which of these do you think has had a faster increase in appropriations? Right, both budgets have increased, with NIA being the clear winner. I'm drawing no conclusions here. There's obviously a lot going on, including the aging of the population. And please don't freeze my NIA grant. This is my final slide. I'll stop here. Thanks for listening.
Okay, Sam, thank you very, very much for that. And now the format that we have is that each one of our past PAA president panelists is going to receive some questions and discussions from a PhD student. And commenting and questioning Dr. Preston is Alexis Dennis, who is a PhD student in sociology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. She holds an MA in sociology and an MPH in health behavior, both from Chapel Hill. Alexis, over to you.
Thank you. And Sam, I'm really excited to have the privilege of commenting on your presidential address, which was actually published 4 years before I was born. And I say that not to poke fun at anybody's age, but I'm going to turn 32 at the end of December. And I think it's incredible that you were able to accurately identify and describe some demographic trends and political forces that shaped my childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood as a millennial, but also Generation Z, which you've talked about today. And I think it speaks to the incredible prescience of strong demographic work. And so the first question I have for you is about some of the racial and ethnic heterogeneity and the trends that you've described. In your 1984 address, you state, quote, "With regard to race, let me say that the main theme here is the changing status of American children, a group that includes all races. There's not a single trend that I've talked about that does not pertain to both races, whites and blacks." And I'm wondering, to what extent do you stand by this claim today?
Thanks, Alexis, and thanks for your kind comments. I think the claim remains accurate. The reason I made it actually at the time was that there were people who were suggesting that the real problems with American children were located among racial minorities. All was well among white non-Hispanics. Moynihan himself, I think, probably contributed to this perception through his book, The Negro Family, and he was widely criticized for this. I think that's one reason, in fact, that he welcomed my paper. It sort of got him off the hook a little bit by extending the analysis to all groups together. The claim is about shared trends. I think it's accurate with respect to shared trends. If you were to look at cross sections, of course, it's certainly the case that Blacks and Hispanics are on the wrong side of the income distribution at every age, childhood, adulthood, older ages. And the wealth gaps between Black and white households are massive, on the order of 10 to 1. So with respect to poverty and wealth, there's no doubt, I think, that Blacks and Hispanics continue to suffer the brunt of our massive inequalities. Are Black and Hispanic children catching up? In poverty trends, it depends on what poverty series you use again. They are not catching up if you use official poverty series figures. They are catching up if you use the supplementary poverty series. I think for childhood, in fact, the supplementary series is superior, but I'm sorry to have to leave that ambiguity. Back to you, Alexis.
Yeah, that was great, and really helpful to hear your perspective on the context for why you made that claim. The next question that I have for you is about a mechanism that you described in your paper about political power. So on the one hand, The Guardian published this article in 2018 that described America as a gerontocracy because the average age of our congressional representatives is 59. And then on the other hand, recent analysis suggests that millennials and Gen Z are particularly politically active. And we also know that these generations face economic and educational prospects that are worse off than their parents. And so I'm wondering if you would, what you would predict are the implications of these trends for the political balance of power in the next decade or two. Do you think that notions of effective individualism that you described in your paper would be as strong in younger generations as it is in older generations in the future? Or do you think that we'll begin to see a shift towards public investments in younger age groups as more and more Gen Z and millennials come of age to vote?
Very important questions. I'm certainly pleased to see that Generation Z has become more politically active than earlier cohorts at those ages. They certainly have the most at stake in many of the major issues that we face. Judging from surveys, Generation Z is more progressive, more pro-government than other groups. And as far as I'm concerned, that's good because government programs hold an important key to improving well-being for all groups, children and other groups as well. One of the worthwhile things I learned doing this review is that many government programs for children, some of them quite recent, have been very effective improving health, education, and economic outcomes. There's a really good paper by Janet Curry in the October Health Affairs that reviews some of the evidence for the success of these well-evaluated programs. Unfortunately, I think you have to recognize that the issues confronting Generation Z and other generations include front and center programs for older people. Our old age welfare state, as some people have called it, is sort of on a collision course with our age distribution. Mm-hmm. The number of people above age 65 is going to increase by 25 million or 44% or so over the next 20 years. It's going to be tough and tougher to maintain the current levels of support for older people, let alone to increase them. I'm guessing that this issue is going to start to dominate political discourse, not this year when so much else is going on, but soon. In any event, we welcome Generation Z into the mix of voices that will be heard in making these important decisions.
Okay, thank you, Sam and Alexis. We need to move on at this point, but everybody remember that after all of the panelists have talked and we've had the doctoral student questions and answers, then we'll open it up to the public for more discussion. Okay, thank you, Sam and Alexis, very, very much. Our next panelist.
Sam, can you stop sharing, please?
Yes, I'd be delighted to.
Yeah.
And sorry, John, before you introduce the next speaker, if I could just ask panelists to stop sharing your screens once you're done with your presentations. Thanks.
Okay, so our next panelist is Dr. Jane Menken, who is research professor at the Institute of Behavioral Science at the University of Colorado Boulder, where she is also Distinguished Professor of Sociology. She was president of the PAA in 1985, at which time she was teaching at Princeton. Then prior to joining Sam Preston, actually at Penn for a number of years, until she moved to the University of Colorado in 1997. So Jane, over to you. Let's see, Jane, maybe we need to unmute you.
Jane, are you muted?
Okay. Jane, we can see your screen, but we can't see or hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Well, there we go.
Yes.
There we go. Yes,
Yeah.
good. Okay.
Good.
Technology, here we come. I'm delighted to be here, and I want to thank the History Committee for proposing and organizing this session. I also want to thank Eileen Crimmins and Sarah Curran and all the PAA leaders and staff for leaping in to figure out ways PAA members can participate in the intellectual life of our association. It amazes me that my presidential address was over 35 years ago, and that just about all the issues I considered are relevant and unsolved today. I focus on two main topics, the extent of infertility and the changing extent of family responsibilities. I'll first talk about fertility and infertility. In the early 1980s, there was great concern that infertility was on the rise. One study proposed that a woman's fertility fell off a cliff when she turned 30, and that if she wanted children at all, she'd better get with the program early. I tried to dispel that notion. In populations in which late marriage was common, it was clear that fertility declined with age, but the decline was much more gradual than had been claimed. Why then was there so much concern? I attributed it partly to the fact that more women were postponing children and childbearing to later ages, where indeed the likelihood of fertility problems was higher. I argued that two other factors came into play. In earlier times, the problem was unexpected fertility. Mothers told their daughters once was enough for them to become pregnant. In a way, we were substituting a myth of infertility for the earlier one of superfertility. In addition, the new science of infertility treatment was providing new ways for those who sought a wanted pregnancy and child to accomplish their goals. My prediction then, it is possible that fear of infertility may move childbearing back to somewhat younger ages, and childlessness may increase. Infertility treatment will continue to grow. I was totally wrong on fertility. What we see here is that there has been a remarkable shift to older ages. Total fertility shown here has changed not very much, declined somewhat, but there has been a shift of nearly 4 years in the age pattern of fertility. Women are having babies later. Interestingly, the most recent data indicate that women are not foregoing childbearing altogether, but there is a lot of concern that childlessness will increase. I don't see the evidence in existing data, but certainly the concern is there. I don't have time today to go into different differentials in fertility patterns, but just want to show you differences for white and Black women. Note especially the dramatic decline in fertility for Black women, the declines for teens, and especially for Black teens. The concern about infertility has remained, but there is general recognition that postponement of childbearing to later ages means possibly facing infertility. The need for treatment seems to have been accepted as the price we pay for postponing, and women and couples seek treatment. As researcher and mother, I believe the very understandable desire to have at least one viable ovum implanted led to the implantation of way too many ova, leading to the combination of joy and health and life problems higher multiples may experience. An obvious indicator that people are seeking infertility treatment can be found in the explosion of twin, triplet, and higher multiple births. The infertility industry began reducing the number of ova implanted around the turn of the 21st century, so that the numbers and rates of triplet and higher births began decreasing. In the last few years, twin births began to decline as well. So that's the story on fertility. Overall, fertility has not declined much, and the age pattern looks quite similar, but simply shifted upward by about 4 years. Put another way, women and couples have postponed births, but not foregone them. I then turn to the impact of demographic change on the family. For simplicity, I only consider women and divide them into 3 generations. The women in the middle, women born in a certain year who are the base for my talk, and fill in Sam's talk, which considered the previous generation, their mothers, and the next generation, their children. Here's what I said in 1985. The graph taken from my paper tells the story of steadily increasing presence of elders, as we all know, and the decline in the presence of children, with the exception of the baby boom. After the baby boom, the overlap of responsibilities to the next and the previous generation combined began to decrease because the decline in fertility was enough to counter the increase in aging parents. The graph doesn't tell the whole story, however, because as fertility declined, women had fewer siblings with whom to share their responsibilities to their parents. Women also entered the labor force in record numbers, so that for many of them, the years of overload of responsibility were magnified by moving outside the home and into the labor market. They had an unusually high dose of responsibilities. I asked then, and I will ask again today, where could they look for help? I'll return to possible answers shortly. So in thinking of today, I decided to do a very rough repeat of calculating years and timing of responsibilities, adding information on employment and adding information on children under 5. I repeat, this is a very rough repeat. I looked first at survival of mothers. Expectation of life for all women in the US increased nearly 4 years, from 77 to 81. While the probability mom is alive hasn't changed very much, what has changed is that she is older. Daughters are younger when their mothers reach senior age status. We saw earlier that women were having children at older ages. Here we see they were having an elderly parent at younger ages. I then looked at the ages at which women had a young child in the home. These are CPS data from 1985, actually, and 2020. Again, we see the shift. Women are older when they have a child under 5, older when they have a child under 18. But I wanted here to address employment. Employment of women has increased. Employment of women with a young child has, shall we use the term, skyrocketed. And we can see this here for children under 5, children under 18. I then recalculated years of responsibility for to children under 18 and mothers over 65. Years with a living mother, I'm not showing here because they're so high. It's well over 50 years under both mortality scenarios. The number of years with a mother over 65 has increased, with a child under 18 slightly decreased. The overlap of a child under 18 in employment increased. The overlap of having both mom and child in the so-called dependent groups increased, and the number of years with triple responsibility increased. So what we have seen is that daughters have a great deal of responsibility. The figures are much longer because children are under 5 for a very short time. So they're much lower in this graph. So what's happened since 1985? Women and couples have chosen to reduce responsibilities to children somewhat by having slightly fewer, but the main change is to defer childbearing to older ages, perhaps when the woman and the family are better able to manage responsibilities to children.
Jane, can I just interrupt with 2-minute warning? Sorry.
Okay, I'm right on time. Perhaps when the woman and the family are better able to manage responsibilities to children. They're blessed with having their own parents around, but those parents are older. Daughters have increased time in all the overlap categories: increased employment with young children, increased overlap of young children and older mothers, and increased triple overlap. What does that mean for children? There's been a clear rise, and over 60% of children under 5, Black and white, have a working mother. In 1985, I asked what changes could be made to recognize and reduce the set of responsibilities parents were shouldering. One was to have no children, wiping out all the years of responsibility women had to their children. But that's clearly a choice Americans are reluctant to make. I also asked what changes could be made to ameliorate the burdens of responsibility. Affordable childcare, greater involvement of fathers and sons, greater flexibility in work schedules. Men have in many cases stepped up, but women still bear the greater responsibility. Elders are healthier and may need less assistance at the same age than in the past. But if anything, the social response to the need to raise our children well remains sorely lacking. I again raised the call for improved childcare, for schools that mesh their schedules with parental work, for a better safety net when work fails. All of these issues were there when COVID-19 hit. Parents were already dealing with a combination of work and kids, and were suddenly expected to adapt to working from home, or working in possibly dangerous situations as essential workers, or not working at all as they lost their employment. At the same time, parents, especially mothers, were expected to take charge of education of children, the one area that we thought was outsourced. And many were worried about their own parents, who were especially vulnerable due to age, and in many cases due to the isolation imposed to keep them safe. This pandemic casts a strong spotlight on the problems of healthcare in the United States, the problems of parents and children, and the inadequacies of our social support. We've seen what a pandemic does. What we don't see is that in pre-COVID times, the responsibilities of parents, especially mothers, were high, and their ability to cope with them or with sudden change was fragile. My hope is first that we get through these pandemic times while acknowledging all who have been lost and all who continue to struggle with the sequelae of COVID-19 illness. I have no doubt that we will continue to have children and continue to love them and love our parents. But I also hope that the pandemic brings to the fore the responsibility load parents face in the best of times. I hope we can look to Sam for measures that will ensure that the burden on those in the middle generation is reduced. Thank you.
Jane, thank you very, very much. We really appreciate that. And commenting and questioning Dr. Menken's presentation here is Kyungwon Choy, who is PhD student in sociology at the University of Chicago. She holds an MA in sociology from Mihwa Women's University in Seoul, Korea. So Kyungwon Choy, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk, Dr. Menken, and I would also like to thank the History Committee for putting together this event. As Dr. Menken just discussed, United was about women who are caught between their own children and their parents. For these women, family responsibilities to both older parents and younger children loomed large, and Dr. Menken's calculation of the number of years women would spend as a daughter and a mother was a powerful way of showing the sets of expectations and obligations laid out in front of the woman in the middle. Last year, my population seminar had a lively discussion about what has changed and not changed since this address was given. For example, with better contraceptive technologies and better access to assisted reproductive technologies, women today seem to have better control over whether and when to have children than women in the 80s. But women today, like women in the 80s, still find themselves asking, should I have a child, owing to the continuing family responsibilities that burden them. We also talked about gender and how husbands and brothers are more involved in housework than before, but how care work is still primarily a woman's job. Social class and race were also brought up in the discussion as we're constantly reminded that family experiences diverge along racial and social class lines. The fact that the address, which was given 35 years ago, raised so many relevant questions and thoughts on a wide array of topics in year 2020 is a testament to Dr. Menken's presidential address to women in the middle today. As shown by Dr. Menken just now, women still face many years of responsibility, and this leads me to my two questions. The first question is about where women can ask for help, and the second question is about the interdependence among women in the family. And the first question, which I believe Dr. Menken just answered partly, is that in your address, you ask an important question of where could women ask for help, and you're calling attention to the role of the public sector. In your view, how has the public sector changed, and what more should be done by the public sector, and what kind of burdens still remain in the family? And the second question is, the changes experienced by women in the middle consequently affect other women in the family. How might the prolonged years of responsibility faced by women in the middle have affected the mothers of women in the middle and the daughters of women in the middle?
Wow, those are great questions. Thank you, Juan. As far as where do I think we should go for help? I think what we've seen as schooling disappeared, we see the dependence on schools for the greatest assistance of all for parents. And we've seen the demands for better daycare moving that earlier. Where can we go for assistance? I think that one thing is to transform the school system. Why is it that our school schedules are completely incompatible with our work schedules? Another is to change our work schedules. And we're seeing one thing that COVID-19 has taught us is that people don't have to be in the office or in a place of business other than their own home all the time. We have colleagues who are working from outside the US where no one can know that they're not sitting in their office within the US as long as they change their time schedules. I also think the incompatibility of work and family life could be alleviated with better business practices, allowing women to move out of the labor force and back in without the penalties women pay today for making that choice. So that those are just some of the things, and I've mentioned some of the others. What does it do to relationships? For many people, I talked about older women as part of the dependent group. We're sitting here with 4 panelists, at least 3 of whom are well into the over 65 group, and are all running around and doing lots of things. I think grandparents have played a major role. I don't have data, but that's something I would like to explore. I think that for the daughters in the middle, the kinds of programs that Sam talked about have alleviated certain kinds of responsibilities that the people in the middle took on, so that, as he said, they are willing to support politically efforts to improve situations for older parents. As for our children, as we have had fewer children, I'll leave it to others to talk about the changing relationships with those children. And in some ways, they're closer. In some ways, it's more difficult when you have only one or two children in the household, so that parents are more responsible for the time of their children at home. Those are things I can't answer. They're all interesting, and I really thank you.
Okay, so I think we're going to have to leave it there, given our time constraints. Thank you very, very much, Kyungwon Choy, for the questions, and Jane for your answers as well. So our next panelist today is Dr. Arlen Thornton, who is professor of sociology at the University of Michigan, where he is also a research professor in the Population Studies Center and Survey Research Center. He has spent his entire career at the University of Michigan and was president of the PAA in 2001. So, Dr. Thornton, over to you.
Thank you, John, for your introduction, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this session today. Today, I'm going to give a report of my work and other people's works on the topic of my presidential address since 2021, when I gave it. For more information on this talk, I invite you to have a look at my developmentalidealism.org website, where I provide a list of projects, books, and papers dealing with this topic in the last 19 years. And I list out many of my colleagues who have worked on the project and have been important in it, and whose work I include in my discussion today. I'll first summarize very briefly my talk 19 years ago. I'll begin with part one, where I discussed the creation of certain myths about family change in Western history. I introduced the developmental paradigm as an ancient framework that you can trace its origins back to Greece, Rome, Christian enlightened theologians in the Enlightenment. It's a model of change where change is natural, uniform, and directional. You can summarize it with this little simplistic graph where development goes upwards across time. And many people in the past used this model to place societies at different levels of development along this trajectory. This is a list of countries and their development according to Edmund Morgan in the late 1800s, who said that development started at the lowest with Australian Aborigines, went up to the Aztecs and Chinese, and on to his very own England. Now, if you believe this model, which I don't, you can literally read the history of families and families change by taking a trip around the world. You can start off here in Australia with the Aborigines, and you can go on over to Tahiti up to the Aztecs, and you can write the history of families in any country or for the whole world for that matter. I talked about how this framework was used from the 1700s through the early 1900s to describe family change. where many concluded that sometime in Northwest Europe's past, there had been a great family transition from family patterns outside of Northwest Europe to patterns inside Northwest Europe. Then in the last half of the 20th century, researchers studied family change in Northwest Europe using historical data from the past to the present. And they found that there was no such great family transition from family patterns outside Northwest Europe to patterns inside Northwest Europe. And they labeled this so-called great family transition a myth. Now, in the second part of my talk, I introduced developmental idealism as a force for family and fertility change. I argued that developmental idealism, DI for short, grew out of the developmental paradigm and conclusions from reading history sideways. I discussed DI as a culture with many powerful beliefs and values, the value that modern society is good, the value that modern family is good, the belief that modern society is a cause and effect of a modern family, and the belief that freedom, equality, and consent are human rights. I argued that DI culture had strengthened in Northwest Europe. I also argued that DI culture had spread widely outside Northwest Europe, and that DI had been a powerful force for family change around the world. I gave some examples like increasing gender equality, age at marriage, and family planning as things that had been encouraged by the spread of DI. Now, after my talk 19 years ago, I expanded the talk into a book-length book, Reading History Sideways, which was published by the University of Chicago Press in 2005. The book provided clarification, details, and more examples. I realized as I was finishing the book that we had little evidence about the DI beliefs and values of ordinary people, and I provided an agenda to rectify that. I said that we should create tools to study DI among ordinary people. I said we should use those new tools and empirical studies to evaluate how widespread DI is among ordinary people, to evaluate factors affecting the spread and acceptance of DI, and to study consequences of DI for important behaviors. We implemented this research agenda with the involvement of American and international collaborators from several disciplines. We've collected many types of data, ethnographies, in-depth interviews, focus group surveys, and panel studies. We've done some kind of data collection in 18 countries now, 2 of those being in the Western Hemisphere. Several countries from Southeast Europe, several countries from the Middle East, Malawi in Southern Africa, 2 countries on the Indian subcontinent, and countries in East and Southeast Asia. What I want to do next is discuss some of the findings, just briefly mention some of the findings from these data collections. First, is ordinary people around the world indeed do understand and use the concept of development. Second, researchers can reliably measure DI beliefs and values at the individual level. Many people have DI beliefs that development causes change and family attributes such as marriage arrangements, gender equality, and fertility. And many people have DI beliefs that certain family attributes increase development. Many people also have the DI value that modernity is good. We've also documented that many socioeconomic factors are related to individual endorsement of DI, such as country, region, and so forth. Our panel data also suggests the DI beliefs and values are associated with subsequent self-choice marriage, migration, and low rates of marriage and childbearing. We've also extended the scope of our subject matter from family and fertility to a wider listing of phenomenon. We've documented the influence of DI on national and international development programs. We've investigated the ways that people mentally link development with freedom, democracy, and human rights. We've documented links between the media and DI, both media content and people's views of the media. We've documented DI as a factor in international relations. We've documented the influence of DI on clothing and hairstyles. We've studied migration as a cause and a consequence of DI. And we've documented the ways people mentally link morality and development. We've done some more case studies and just mention a few of them. We've investigated the influence of DI on marriage and fertility in Central and Eastern Europe after the fall of state socialism. We've studied the influence of DI on family life in Egypt, Iran, and Tunisia. We've talked about DI and the search for modern China. We've investigated DI and its relationship to schemas of family change in India. We've documented DI and changes in family and clothing styles in Turkey. We've documented resistance to and adoption of family planning in Kenya. And we've studied people's linkage of development and television in Vietnam. I want to mention just a few of the clarifications, emphases, and modifications we've made in the framework over the last 19 years. The first one is...
Arlen, just to mention, we're about the 2-minute warning, okay?
Thank you, John. I think I'm right on target.
Good.
The study of DI actually involves two very different parts. The first is the culture part. The DI is a culture similar to other cultures with worldviews, beliefs, and values. Then there's the theory part about how the strengthening and spread of DI affects laws, programs, and individual and family behavior. Our second clarification is that our interest is not motivated by a belief in DI, that its propositions and are the way the world works, that it's true, or from an endorsement of its values, but because we believe that DI affects the way the world operates and the way societies and individuals behave. Third, the elements and sub-elements of DI do not usually come as an integrated package, but as a network of both closely and weakly interrelated items. Fourth, the elements and sub-elements of DI have evolved over the last several hundred years, and we now divide DI into the original DI of the 19th century and the new elements of DI that have since been added. We recognize that the spread of DI depends upon both the characteristics of the disseminators and the history, culture, and structure of the receiving place. We also emphasize now that the introduction of DI into a place is often met with very strong resistance and strong opposition. We also emphasize now that the changes brought by spread and the strengthening of DI often happen slowly over long time periods, often with the hybridization of DI culture with the original culture. Lastly, we've modified how we describe the elements that we include in DI culture. Our first element here of the three is that belief about societies are at different levels of development and they move from traditional to modern. A second element of DI culture is the belief that many of the elements of modern society have reciprocal cause and effect relationships, and the value that modern society is good and covers many aspects of society, including modern family and other elements. As I'll show in this final slide here, we've included a lot of things within the DI framework of modernity, which DI also defines as good. So we have our family arrangements ranging from monogamy to older marriage ages to planned and low fertility. There's a resource element where wealth and health are defined as modern and good, also technology. There's a social norms and values elements where pluralism, individualism, universalism, and so forth are defined as modern and good. And also a social institutions element where free markets, education, and democracy are all defined as modern and good. For more information on this work in the last 19 years, I invite you to again have a look at the Developmental Idealism.org website. And I'll close with a thank you for listening. I appreciate your time.
Well, Arlen, thank you very, very much. We really appreciate that. And now turning to the discussion question section following your presentation, we have Andrea Tilstra, who is a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Colorado Boulder. She holds a BA in sociology and communication from the University of Pittsburgh. So Andrea, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, John. And thanks to the rest of the History Committee for organizing this, and to Dr. Thornton for the opportunity to provide some commentary and ask some questions on your talk. I'll keep my comments relatively brief and organized around two big thoughts, I guess. And the first is that your 2001 presidential address and the subsequent demography publication really highlighted a cautionary tale of why we ought not generalize across contexts and across societies. You remind us that change, while it's inevitable, is certainly not uniform. And this highlights the necessity of acknowledging culture in demographic studies, which leads me to my second major point, and that is that your address does a wonderful job of threading together theories from cultural sociology and demography. And developmental idealism itself, as you've just reminded us, is itself one part culture and one part theory. And I would argue that demographers are continually working to integrate culture and theory. But I would also argue that there's still room for improvement in this integration of culture and demography. And this leads me to my two big questions, which you feel free to address one or both of these, time permitting. And the first is that how can demographers better acknowledge cultural heterogeneity, especially when we're discussing and analyzing these population level phenomena? And second is that if culture is a toolkit, as many sociologists, cultural sociologists in particular, argue, what components of culture are the most important for demographers who are interested in studying population change?
Thank you, Andrea, for your generous comments and interesting questions. Let me begin by saying that I wholeheartedly agree that there is still room for improvement in combining culture and demography. And I hope that we demographers increase our efforts in that very important area. On your first question, I guess my first comment on how to do this is to keep it very clearly in mind that cultures and all the things associated with culture are clearly part of what's going on and should be part of our analyses to the extent that we can. I also suggest as we do that we remember each society has its own history. History matters, path dependence is real and important. And my third comment on that is to say that it's very important that we can, when appropriate, take interaction effects into account. Now, concerning your question about the most important factors affecting the spread of DI, I'll mention two very broad items. The first is the power of the ideas contained within DI culture. The second is the power of the people who endorse DI culture. I believe that the culture of DI is spread around the world by both the power of the ideas within DI and by the power of the people who hold the ideas of DI. Now, concerning the power of the ideas, DI includes a very large number of cultural elements, such as worldviews, schema, beliefs, values. And in my view, it's the enormity and comprehensiveness of this network of ideas, and not just one or two individual elements, that make DI one of the most important forces for change in the world. Now, a comment concerning the power of the people with the ideas of DI. I will note that at least since 1492, DI has been disseminated around the world by people with enormous power. The list of power bases for disseminators is very long and includes such things as the economic, military, technology, political, medical, and even demographic. I could provide many examples of how these power bases have been important for spreading DI globally, but I'll honor our time constraints and leave those examples for another day. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you, Arlen. Thank you, Andrea, very, very much for that. And now we move to our final panelist, who is Dr. Barbara Entwistle. She is Keenan Distinguished Professor of Sociology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where she also serves as Training Director of the Carolina Population Center. She has been at Chapel Hill since 1985, and she has been Director of the Carolina Population Center, as well as Vice President for Research at Chapel Hill. She was President of the PAA in 2007. Dr. Entwistle, to you. Let's see, you have
Yes, I had to figure out how to unmute once I put this up. Thank you so much. Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. Thank you for coming to hear our updated presidential addresses. I must say it's an honor and a privilege to be part of this group. And I give my thanks to the History Committee, to Eileen Crimmins, and to Sarah Curran as well. My address is the most recent of these. It's so recent that PowerPoint can still read my original slides. I have fewer years to cover, which makes my job easier, but I'm also coming at the end of 4 presentations, which means that I should keep this short. I'll do my best. My address was called Putting People into Place. In addition to being short, sweet, and alliterative, the title captured exactly what I wanted to talk about: contexts of demographic and health behavior. Unlike most, I've devoted my career to independent variables, specifically the features of contexts, villages, neighborhoods, communities that might affect and be affected by demographic and health behavior. I wanted to talk in my presidential address about the value of blending social and spatial perspectives in understanding contexts and their effects. Both figure nicely in the concept of place. By place, we mean the human and physical characteristics of a location. So my address reviewed the field and identified areas where progress was needed and could be made in understanding people in place. I had a lot to say. A challenge of this short update is to decide exactly what to update. So I narrowed my choice to 3 points from the 2007 address, which is probably still too many. The first, demographers should consider multiple dimensions of context, especially spatial and environmental, as well as social dimensions. Second, demographers should consider the dynamics of contextual effects, including individual choice and the consequences of individual choice. And third, cross-fertilization would be beneficial. I'll start with the need to consider multiple dimensions of context. Even here, I have to be very choosy about what to discuss. So I've chosen to make my points in the context of 2 illustrations. The first is pollution, poverty, and health in the US. The second is climate change and demographic outcomes in lower and middle income countries, what we used to call LDCs. In 2007, the literature on neighborhood effects on health in the US was dominated by studies of poverty. Very few looked at hazards and toxins through a neighborhood lens, and those that did not control for poverty. In 2007, research on climate change and demographic outcomes was just getting underway. This is an area that has blossomed since then. Turning to the literature on pollution, poverty, and health in the US. In 2007, I was unable to find a single study of neighborhood effects that included both. This was a problem. Both are plausible determinants of health outcomes, depending on the outcome, and they are correlated. So to measure the effect of either, you need to include both. Significant progress has been made. I've selected 2 studies as illustration. The first is the one by Jennifer Aylshire and Eileen Crimmins, was published in 2014. These authors linked measures of air pollution, defined as areas with higher concentrations of PM 2.5, as well as measures of neighborhood poverty and other characteristics of census tracts, with measures of cognitive function among older adults in the Health and Retirement Survey. Worse cognitive function was found for respondents living in areas characterized by poverty and pollution. The second study is by Robert Manduca and Rob Sampson. These authors start with data in the Opportunity Atlas. That's Raj Chetty's project, which links IRS and other data to study social mobility among children born between 1978 and 1982. They were interested in whether exposure to lead and to air pollution during adolescence affected adult income, as well as some other outcomes. And they were interested specifically in children whose parents were in the bottom 25% of the income distribution. They also controlled for poverty and other characteristics of census tracts. Exposure to toxins and to poverty depresses income mobility. I'm happy to say that it's no longer necessary to be a geographer or to collaborate with one to incorporate environmental as well as social characteristics of context in health research. Here is an example of what is available for the Health and Retirement Survey. I want to give a shout out to Jennifer Aylshire for her work on this. One note, access to these resources requires access to the restricted portions of the data. I now turn to climate change and demographic outcomes. Again, I select 2 studies as illustration. One is a recent publication of my own with Ashton Verdry and Natalie Williams. It looks at migration response to floods and droughts in a region in rural Northeast Thailand. It takes an agent-based modeling approach. Importantly, it incorporates village social context, including aspects of that context that change as a result of migration, such as the structure of kin networks. I will have more to say about this study a little later. The other study is by Frank Davenport, Audrey Duralian, and Catherine Grace. These authors look at exposure to very hot days during pregnancy, very hot meaning 105 degrees or higher, and the consequences for pregnancy loss and birth weight. They use demographic and health survey data from 15 African countries. They control for a variety of factors, including livelihood zone, a contextual variable that captures how people who live in a particular place make their living. Are they agriculturalists or agropastoralists? Exposure to hot days had a deleterious effect, even controlling for livelihood zone. One of the reasons I chose the Davenport et al. Study is that it used locational coordinates in the DHS surveys to join climate measures to the DHS data. IPPMS has just released DHS contextual variables, which include environmental as well as social variables that can be linked with respondent data in DHS. So again, you do not have to be a geographer to do this kind of work. To preserve confidentiality, in this case, locational coordinates have been displaced. So in 2007, I recommended that demographers should consider multiple dimensions of context, especially spatial and environmental, as well as social dimensions. Check. Significant progress has been made. I now turn to my second recommendation, which is that demographers should consider the dynamics of contextual effects, including individual choice and the consequences of individual choice. I'd like to start with a few remarks about timing. When I gave my address in 2007, virtually all studies of neighborhood effects used a cross-section of neighborhoods. This is true with the Aschel-Crimmins study. They linked measures of air pollution in 2004, measures of poverty in 2000, to measures of cognitive functioning among respondents in the HRS in 2004. In the Manduka-Sampson piece, the focus is on exposure during adolescence and subsequent outcomes, including income mobility for those born between 1978 and 82, a particular cohort. Timing of exposure is a specific interest in the Davenport et al. Study. These authors used pregnancy history data in the DHS, and for each pregnancy, align each trimester with the temperatures prevailing at that time. They hypothesized that exposure to very hot days could affect pregnancy outcomes differently, depending on when the pregnancy exposure occurred. Their results provide some support for this idea, although there are some issues of selectivity that complicate things. It is worth noting that their analysis is based on more than 65,000 pregnancies. That's a lot of aligning to do. When I gave my original address in 2007, the field was dominated by an approach organized around exposure. It still is. In my original address, I called this the trickle down, the notion that effects of context kind of rain down on the folks who are there. But contexts change, and people change contexts. Let me start with the first point, context change. Here, I'm returning to the effects of climate change. What you see here is annual precipitation in Nang Rong, Thailand, the case that was the focus of my article with Verdry and Williams. This is a monsoonal climate, and agriculture here is very dependent on the monsoon. The graph shows 50 years of data for the second half of the 20th century. You can see that on average, weather is getting drier, but there's an awful lot of variability around that trend. Some years are very wet, others are very dry. To the extent that climate change continues these patterns, we might wonder whether people who live in Nang Rong have already adapted to wet and dry years. Contexts change, and people change contexts. They can change contexts when they move from place to place. I wish I had time to elaborate on issues of mobility. There's a lot to say. People change contexts when they move, and these contexts are changed by their moving. This is relevant to our understanding of slow onset climate change and its consequences for migration. And what I want to show is that migration can affect the composition of social contexts, and it can affect the social relational structure of social context. Starting with the first, I'm going to share PowerPoints that were in the original presentation 13 years ago.
Barbara, just a comment. I think we're about at the 2-minute warning.
Thank you, John. I'm right on time.
Good.
So let me just go back. What you can see here is that when the orange individual moves to the context on the left, replacing a red individual who then moves to the right, what starts as two slightly heterogeneous contexts become two homogeneous contexts. Thomas Schelling described processes like these in his agent-based model of residential segregation. The structure of social relationships can also be changed. Consider this example. The lines between pairs of individuals denote social relationships. You can see that the context on the left, which started out as pretty well connected, becomes a context of mostly isolates, whereas the context on the right is not changed in this instance. My point is simple. In addition to top-down processes that we've been studying since O.D. Duncan published his first multi-level model of fertility in 1964, there are bottom-up processes that we are just beginning to understand. In the Nang Rong study, constructing a model that incorporates bottom-up processes as well as top-down processes yielded some new insights. Experiments using an agent-based model run under different climate scenarios, 40 villages, suggest first that climate shocks did not affect outmigration in these villages. These are rural villages. People migrate to urban areas for work. It is mobility very consistent with ideas coming from the so-called new economics of labor migration, where households diversify spatially by sending members elsewhere to places subject to different risks than faced at home. So why don't shocks increase outmigration? Well, this was a place where there was already a lot of climate up and down, as I showed you. It's a place where young people are already leaving and returning as they made the transition to adulthood. So these adaptations had already occurred. The climate shocks are not new in that sense. But the climate shocks do reduce return migration in almost every instance. And it turns out that endogenous social networks mediate these effects. To explain all this would take me 50 minutes or so, and instead I refer you to the article. What I want to say is this, that we are just beginning to understand the dynamics of these effects. In 2007, I identified some directions for future research pertinent to putting people into place. Demographers should consider multiple dimensions of context, especially spatial and environmental, as well as social dimensions. As I have argued, we are well on our way. Demographers should consider the dynamics of contextual effects, including individual choice and the consequences of individual choice. Here, we're just getting started. And finally, some cross-fertilization would be beneficial. The literature was fragmented when I reviewed it 13 years ago, and it still is. It's fragmented by dependent variable. It's fragmented by where research gets done. There are hints of progress, but there's much more that could be learned through some cross-fertilization. In closing, I would like to share the acknowledgement slide that I used in my original talk. These are photos of mentors and collaborators who were critical to my development as a scholar. It is a pleasure to recognize them again. Thank you for your attention.
Barbara, thank you very much for putting people in place, as well as a nice photo at the end of quite a few PAA presidents in that group, as a matter of fact. So now discussing your comments, we have Nick Graetz, who's a PhD candidate in sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. He holds a master's degree in demography from Penn, as well as an MPH in health metrics and evaluation from the University of Washington. Nick, over to you.
Thanks, John. I'm grateful for the opportunity to comment on Barbara's address, which has been really formative in guiding my own research. I think since this address from 2007 and Barbara's updated points just now, it raises a lot of really challenging issues for place and population research that we're still grappling with today. I think a big critique for me that stands from this address is that the object of study is often a fixed characteristic of place, rather than a social or economic relation that is arranged spatially, or a social network dynamic. I think there have been a lot of similar critiques of this literature since your address in 2007. So I'm kind of just wondering broadly how we continue to make progress here. For example, when we think about something like exposure to climate change, as Barbara just mentioned, we can think about estimating the effect of a climate variable, like the long-run consequences of rising temperatures or the shocks of acute disasters. But we can also think about estimating the processes which produce climate change and position certain populations at highest risk. So I'm wondering, what are the relational dynamics determining who lives in which places? Who is producing the spatial arrangement of climate risk and putting people into places at highest risk? As you discuss in your address, our questions are often constrained by data availability, and the systems governing place-based relations are often not going to provide the data to study themselves, which could include actors such as banks, police, or extractive industries. I think these perspectives are central to a lot of other fields, and your address raises how an interdisciplinary approach can be really useful for guiding demographic research here. So I guess I'd just love to hear a bit more about how you think that this has evolved since 2007 and where we can continue to go in collaborating and continuing to push for better data to measure these relational processes.
Well, thank you, Nick. I really appreciate your comments. And one of the joys of doing this is actually a chance to get to know you just a little bit through email and over Zoom. I think there's so many things to say. But one of the changes since 2007 that I did not comment on, but that you're alluding to, is the increasing availability of very new kinds of data. Back in 2007, demographers using remotely sensed imagery, this was sort of pretty new. And as I was showing both with HRS and with DHS, the ability for people to link these up with survey data, it's now sort of broadly available. But in the meantime, there have been a number of new other kinds of data that have become available, some of which are kind of interesting for me to think about. They don't address the banks and the extractive industries, but they do address the ways in which people use space, respond to space, or create space. And here I'm thinking about sort of GPS-enabled, phones, mobile phones. I'm thinking about the kind of work that's been done to understand what the bounds of a neighborhood are. You can look at where people go in a day, and a typical adolescent male in Columbus, Ohio, according to Chris Browning, is not staying very close to the census tract where he or she sleeps. And understanding, sort of how people define their own spaces, I think is a critical piece, and we're getting, closer and closer on that. I think, the idea that the neighborhood that exists for everybody is different for everybody, that you don't have everybody in the same household having the same neighborhood. I remember when I first said that, I got yelled at by somebody. But I really think it's true in the sense that we mean it. Now, in terms of, that's very local kinds of mobility, and I'm wondering whether our sort of spatially referenced sort of social media kinds of data will give us more of a handle on the interconnections between places that you're referring to that also could be dynamic, both with the phone data and the social media data. I mean, the temporal resolution is unbelievable. In fact, it's overwhelming. So, I mean, we have all of the temporal variability that we might wish. So those are two thoughts that I had, Nick, in answer to your question.
Cool. I have one more follow-up question, but I don't know if we're short on time here on this. So you mentioned, talking about how demographic methods, especially with those new data sources, can help shed light on these issues of sort of dynamic selection and cumulative effects over time and different cohorts passing through different places. And in the studies you mentioned, your own studies, you talk about agent-based models as one method of which to address these kind of issues. And in your address in 2007, you kind of have this critique of the advent of multi-level models being very easy to estimate and fit in available software, and that can sort of, in an uncritical way, sometimes enforce this trickle down effective context that you described. And so you suggested in 2007, and in these studies you've presented since then, some examples of more dynamic agent-based models to account for those sort of things. I'm just wondering what you see as kind of the challenges of incorporating those things into the broader literature on place effects and neighborhood effects, and whether, maybe where the points of resistance there are, whether it's in training or getting, what gets published in journals, and where the kind of obstacles are in integrating some of those perspectives.
Okay, so actually we are genuinely out of time. Barbara, maybe just a very, very quick response to that, and then we need to move to the Q&A period so that viewers can have a chance to participate.
I guess quickly, Nick, the agent-based models have a lot of appeal. They also have their own limitations. They are models, exactly that. And I wouldn't say that the model that we were working with for Northeast Thailand is real in any sense. the value of it was to point to something that nobody was looking at. And that was return migration in the context of climate change. And I don't mean by return migration, returning after a disaster. I mean return as sort of the everyday piece. Quickly, I think where demographers are most able to do some more dynamic work, maybe in the selection of neighborhoods and then the exposure to neighborhoods and that piece. And I think the whole field of migration there's so much potential in this area because that is a lot of where the dynamic is coming from. So I could go on, but I won't because John asked me not to. But I thank you very much for your comments. This has been a lot of fun.
Yes, thank you very much to everybody, all the panelists, all the doctoral students doing the questions. And of course, I want to once again thank the PA History Committee, all the committee members who put in a lot of time and effort to make this possible. And thank you very much to Eileen Crimmins, current PA president, and Sarah Curran, current PA vice president, for helping us organize all this. Now, Eileen, do you have some final things to kind of help us organize the Q&A part?
Sarah's going to do that right now.
Sarah's going to do that. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you all. That was wonderful. We're going to turn the floor over to Emily Agree and Wynn Brown, who will facilitate our Q&A. And there are a few Q&As in the open box that they will help to manage.
Emily Merchant.
Okay. I'm sorry, Emily Merchant. I'm so sorry.
Thanks, it's Wynn. Emily and I have been chatting sort of backstage, and we've worked out how to do this. So we thought we would actually start with the most recent question that we got. That's from Daniel Goodkind. And I think what we'll do with this one, and let me know if you can hear me fine, but I think what we'll do with this question is we'll have it posed to all of the panelists because it's a really general question, and I think it's a terrific one. So here is Daniel's question. One curious question: is there a particular achievement in your career which makes you most proud? So that, that's a very poignant question. And I think what we'll do is, Sam, we'll start with you to answer that question, and then we'll go in order. So first, Sam, you've got the first go at that in terms of what's made you most proud in your career. Then Jane will move to you, then Arland, and then to Barbara. Thanks. So Sam, you've got the floor. Thank you.
Am I really limited to only one? There's two things I've been involved in most of my life. One is research and one is teaching. So let me just say, probably the thing that has made me proudest is to have supervised the dissertations of 60 students in mostly demography, and many of whom have gone on to terrific careers to make everybody proud. In terms of research, I think a paper that I wrote long ago called The Changing Relationship Between Mortality and Level of Economic Development is my most cited work. It's a work that I think was largely correct and that shed light on an important issue. The issue being, did mortality improvements in the 20th century come about primarily because of improvements in standards of living, per capita income, or because of more specific health measures and people's personal behaviors and public health behaviors? I think that the paper was somewhat successful in arguing that it was not particularly standards of living that were the source of the gains, but primarily more specific health measures. So that's made me proud. It's been pretty often cited and still is being examined. That's it.
Thank you so much, Sam. Jane, the floor is now over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. And Sam took the words out of my mouth. It's students and young colleagues that I think keep all of us going, and that we are so proud of what they've gone on to do. And for me, it's not only the students in the US in our own universities, but working with students around the world and being involved in the development of programs in countries outside of the US. As far as research, I think the early work that I did with Mindel Sheps was the most innovative of anything I've ever done, where we were trying to model the process of family building and asking questions about what the determinants could be, combining both biological and social determinants there. But what that led me to was to conclude that we needed real data. Models only go so far. And that's where I've spent most of my time since then.
Thank you, Jane. Now it's over to you, Harland. The floor is yours.
Thank you. As I've thought about this the last couple of minutes, thinking in terms of what have I done that might have the most lasting effect, if any effect, and I'm sure, and I'll sort of mirror Sam and Jane in saying it's the people that I've worked with. I see some students, some colleagues as having an enormous effect for a long time into the future. So that's a very high one for me. On the topic of research, I guess I would have to say that the material I talked about today is what I expect to still be getting cited perhaps a few years from now. A lot of what we do sort of disappears. I'm at least hoping that this one continues on and that people keep evaluating the impact of developmental idealism around the world.
Thank you, Harland. Finally, Barbara, it's your turn to talk about something in your career that's made you most proud. Over to you.
Thanks. There's certainly a theme among all of us in the importance of the people that we've worked with, and especially students and postdocs and junior colleagues over time. And like the rest, that's just a tremendous source of pride for me. In terms of research, I'm going to bookend it. I think some of the most influential was the early development of multi-level comparative analysis tools and the application of those in the analysis of fertility. But what I'm most proud of at the moment is actually that AJS paper we just published, which I'm so excited about. And it just is a sort of culmination of years of work for me. And so I'm just extremely pleased about it. Hasn't been cited yet, I don't think. I wouldn't expect so. It just was published, but I'm really very proud of that.
Great, thank you so much. And I know we're all taking notes to go after these papers and make sure we read them and spread them around. So that was the opening question. We're all going to watch the time. But Emily, over to you for the next question.
Yeah, so the rest of the questions that we have are about specific presentations. So the one that I'm going to present is about Arlen's presentation. But I just wanted to make a quick comment. Arlen, you were talking about being cited, and I just wanted to tell you I cite your book all the time. It's been really formative for my research. So thank you for doing this research, this work, and for publishing on it. But the question comes from Sonal Desai, and she asks, would it make sense to integrate DI in stratification literature? Increasing fundamentalism in some countries is not consistent with DI, but maybe if we add a stratification element to it. Adoption of DI for the middle class may be a way of showing superiority, and rejection of DI may be a way of bonding for more fundamentalist groups.
Thank you, Sonal. Several important threads in there. First, I do think it would be highly appropriate to integrate in some way this cultural developmental literature with the social stratification literature. And it's particularly appropriate, in my opinion, because developmental idealism is ultimately, at its roots, a discussion of inequality across peoples, across individuals, and so forth. So that would be my first reaction to that. Yushia and I actually did a paper in China where we worked on people's connecting of the economy, particularly as it related to inequality, to their views of development. And folks in China connect them very closely, seeing development and inequality going together. And that probably comes out at least partially from the fact that the last several decades, the place has boomed economically, it's boomed with inequality, and it's saw an enormous decline in fertility. So it's very easy for Chinese to link them. On the thing about reconnecting it with fundamentalism, let me go back to one of the comments I made a few minutes ago in my talk. We've now come to the clear realization that when developmental idealism gets introduced into a new setting, it's introduced into a setting that has hundreds and thousands of years of its own evolving culture, with its own values, beliefs, worldviews, etc. So it's almost inevitable that the new DI culture ends up with some kind of competition, often conflict, and often even violence. And so we shouldn't think of DI ultimately automatically winning. It's a contest. And oftentimes the forces opposed to it get the upper hand. So as you were alluding to, I think we could identify several places around the world where developmental idealism got put into retreat in a very substantial way, which I think is sort of a, if I may, a natural way of things evolving. But I'd be delighted if folks would move to integrate those literatures more, as you suggest that we should.
Thank you, Arland. Jane, this one is coming back to you. I'm reading something that came from Margaret Green pretty early on. And Margaret Green is asking you, she's saying, thank you for your presentation. I'm struck by the woman-focused model that appears to sideline fathers and sons in the data in our framing of family responsibility. Although you were speaking of parents, your data seem entirely to focus on females. If you had better data on men, what age and caregiving and work patterns do you envision we might see? That's a long question. That's from Margaret Green. If you've understood that, then the floor is yours. Thank you.
Hi, Meg. It's been many years. It's a wonderful question. And of course, my response is data, data, data. It's extremely hard, and I would love to see the ability to match fathers with their children. Mothers, it's so much easier. We can look at that. But that's something that I think we need to move toward. Off the top of my head, what do I think would be the answers? I think there's been such an increase in divorce, remarriage, recombination of families that I suspect that we'll unfortunately still see less involvement of fathers with their children, less involvement of sons in the care of parents. But that's pure speculation. I can't give a good answer because we just don't know. Do I think it's important? Absolutely. Can I think of ways in which to address this? So the data sets that Chetty has put together for following people through administrative data may provide a way in the future to be able to create data sets that include men and follow their family movements. That's my hope. But I use women because we have the much more information.
Thanks,
Thank you,
Jane.
Jane. And yeah, I certainly hope, sorry, Emily, I just wanted to plug, I certainly hope that that there are certain foundations out there that can help us to collect more data on men and couples. Thank you. Thanks for that. So I think it's back to you, Emily.
Okay. Jane, the next question is for you as well. It's from John Haga, who asks, what do we know about recent trends, especially the number of years that adult women spend with these multiple responsibilities in other industrialized countries? I'm guessing that the US is following behind them by 20 years or so, but only guessing.
Same guess. This is something that in preparing for this, I did not have the time to go and look for additional comparisons. My suspicion is that for many countries, there are better systems in place, better support networks, as we've seen and that come out in the data Sam showed about the differences in mortality for the US compared to other countries. What I'd love to do is hear from people. Are these good projects to pursue? And is there sufficient interest that it would be a good idea to work on these projects? So John, I wish I could answer you, but that's as far as I can get.
Maybe could I make one suggestion? As I was listening to you, Jane, I think it's a terrific paper, and the ability to take large-scale demographic changes and move it down into the life cycle of women is exceptionally important. One thing that I think would add a lot of interest and detail that might be also worthwhile bringing men in for is to convert these into something involving time use, so that you had time use over the life cycle. Men's and women's life cycles with respect to family are going to look very different, even though the statuses are roughly the same, perhaps from age to age. Men are spending a lot less time with children and much less time caring for older members of the family. So combining that, what you've shown with time use studies, I think would be very interesting.
Good.
Thanks. And we've got one final question, which is for Arland. Wynn, do you want to present this question?
Oh, I'm having trouble getting myself back into Q&A. If you have it,
yeah, I've got it. So this
Thanks.
one is from Christopher Miller, who asks, Arland, can you elaborate briefly on the differences between 19th century DI and more recent formulations?
Thank you, Chris. Appreciate that question. I alluded that in my brief overview earlier. What this refers to is that the world is changing, and the culture of something like developmental idealism that's living through these changes also changes. So if we went back to 1800, which was right around the time that Malthus was writing, we have this whole thing called the Great Family Transition. Did not include at that time a fertility decline amongst married women. That sort of appeared in the DI literature sort of across the 19th century with the decline of fertility in so much of the Western world. more recently, we've had other kinds of changes that have occurred. And those revolve around such things as divorce, non-marital sex, cohabitation, and unmarried childbearing. And those things have sort of emerged in the Western world in the last century or so, and even more in the last several decades. And it's those things that we are saying were not there: divorce, premarital sex, childbearing, and so forth, would not have been there in 1800 or 1900 as values of DI, but they've sort of become connected with development over the last several decades. And if you ask people around the world about how those things connect with development, as we have, people around the world very tightly connect them with development, and they connect them with the West. And for the most part, they don't much like them.
All right. Thank you very much, Arland, and thank you everyone who participated in this, presidents, responders, and PAA staff who's really risen to this technology and made this wonderful occasion. This webinar will be on our YouTube channel probably this afternoon. So you can tell any of your friends who weren't able to view this that they can watch it. You can have your whole family watch it if you want later on. And Sam, your kids can get you on YouTube. I want to thank the History Committee. This was a great idea. I'm really pleased they're going to continue it. You should realize, if you don't spend a lot of time on the PAA website, that there is a history section to the website that really is quite a bit of fun to look at the history of PAA and the relationships of past presidents and persons. It's a very interesting piece in the website. I spent a good Saturday afternoon there one day and kind of enjoyed myself with that. So I recommend that. This is the end of the 2020 PAA, and Sarah and I are delighted to end 2020. Next year, we're Bob Hummer and Marcy Carlson are intending to continue webinar series, probably something like maybe not as frequently as this year, maybe once a month, every other month, because it really is an opportunity to have sessions that everyone has a chance to attend and to put on YouTube. So we actually think this has worked very well, and we thank everybody so much for today's session and for being part of the PAA community. Today really showed how important all of our relationships are, and everybody's address held up pretty well, I'd say. So thank you and goodbye. We will stop recording now.